This chapter deals primarily with issues around the institution of marriage. The Corinthians had an act of going to extremes, it seems. So Paul has been dealing so far with some of the major issues that they were experiencing. One had to do with the cliques that were developing within the congregation itself. It probably was not a huge congregation at this point. Not only that, there were the cliques, there was the lawsuits and the immorality that was constant there. And some believers really disparagingly treating other believers. Not as brothers and sisters in Christ, but some as superior to others. Some were enamored with wisdom, or what they believed to be wisdom. And Paul has been dealing with that off and on. When we get to chapter 6, he zeroes in on immorality of various forms that was going on within the city of Corinth, but also bleeding over into those that were followers of Christ. And he had to deal with those. And he kind of had to deal with it kind of forthrightly. That you cannot take these pagan practices and baptize them and somehow now feel that they're okay. Call them Christian. And Paul was vigorously dealing with that. I saw a cartoon of, I don't know who did the illustration, and I didn't watch a whole lot of it because I didn't have time, but it popped up on my phone, I think. Anyway, what it was a cartoon character holding a book, and it said, the letter of Paul to the Corinthians. And when he opened it up, a fist came out and bam, 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 right in his face. Kind of what Paul did. It's kind of what Paul did. And even though I'm sure it wasn't a pleasant experience for the Corinthians to receive scathing statements to Paul from Paul, for us it's very beneficial. So Paul finishes up chapter 6 dealing with the issue of immorality and the importance of fleeing from it. He talks about it that all other sins, this is a sin unlike others because you use your body in the sin. And other sins are not necessarily fall in that kind of category. He talks about the issue of being joined to a prostitute, warning the men. No. You can't go to the temples. You can't participate in that. Because that is not simply a physical act. It is an act that has emotional, psychological, and spiritual consequences. And by the way, you don't see that in Hollywood movies. You don't see the warning. It comes with a warning that immorality carries with it a heavy price tag. Very, very. You don't see that. It's not like you watch this stuff, and even if it's not explicit or just implied, there's no consequences. It's just kind of a free for all, kind of thing. No consequences though. There's always consequences. Always consequences. And Paul is going to deal now with concerning about the things about which you wrote. So, he's received questions from the Corinthians on how what do we do about this? How is this to work? Well, apparently some, and that's going to happen a couple more times in the letter of 1 Corinthians, but Paul here, he says, now concerning the matters about which you wrote. It literally says this in the text. It says, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Now, that is the literal rendering of it. Most modern translations will modify that just a little bit to give you an interpretation of what he's actually talking about. But it seems that some in the congregation says, wait a minute, if sex is this much of a problem, maybe it's better to abstain totally, just totally away from it, and not get caught up into the problems that it brings. And Paul is going to have to answer, no, you need to understand the biblical teaching here, and he's going to be alluding to it. So what does he point at? It is good for a man not to touch a woman. Or it's good for a man not to marry. One translation renders it. Others suggest this. It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman because of the problems that come with this. And Paul answers that, and he's going to give an entire chapter dealing with the implications of that question. And it's a very helpful chapter. Oh, I'll get to this in just a moment. It says, but because of temptation to sexual immorality. Now the translation I use here uses the word sexual immorality. Singular. But in the Greek text, it's plural. Because of sexual immoralities is what it is. That just doesn't work good in English, so we don't understand it well in English. But he is talking about all kinds of things. Because of those, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. So he immediately points to the creation order. The creation order you find in the early chapters of Genesis. That God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. General statement mentioned. Then when you move into chapter 2, toward the end of chapter 2, then you realize now Eve is created to be a helper to Adam. And then Adam's proclamation was, she is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she is taken from the man. For this reason a man shall leave his father and his mother and unite with his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Creation order. I keep circling that so you understand. The earth and everything. Creation order. That's important. That's what God has established. That's God's design. That is God's preference. Well, whatever else you want to say. I can't even say anything stronger than preference. That's the way God created us to be. And then he follows that up. That not only a man to have his own wife and a woman to have her own husband. I don't know if you heard this or not, but the Presbyterian Church, I think, is it of America or USA? I get the two mixed up. One is more conservative than the other. The liberal Presbyterians. They're meeting. I think they're meeting this summer to discuss whether clergy need to be monogamous or not. Think about that. And they've opened the door among some within that particular denomination that to include in the idea of relationships. It can include more than just two people. Have you ever heard of a throuple? You look at me like I just stepped off of a spaceship from somewhere. Believe it or not, it's becoming somewhat common. Where my daughter lives in Springdale, Arkansas, the house she lives here, the house that's right here, there's a throuple that live there. One man, two women. It's called a throuple. Polyandry, you ever hear that one? A new one? Well, you're going to hear a lot more about it. That is a multitude of people. It can be two men, two women. It can be small. It can be all kinds of combinations. That polyamory. That's what that means. Poly meaning many, amory lovers. Like amore. Okay. Anyway. So all that's happening. What's the problem? Go back to creation order. We sometimes get so sidetracked in trying to deal with some of this stuff that we fail to go back. Well, what did God say? So let's go back and see. What did he say? And then we can look at the chaos in our world and we can say, well, wait a minute. Do you want to thrive? Do you want to flourish as a human being throughout the course of your life? Then you need to make sure that you're living according to God's creation order. And you will live a much better life. Okay? And of course polygamy, you know about that as well. And I know polygamy is demonstrated in the Bible, but I want to tell you something. Can you find one positive relationship that includes polygamy? Find one. Not even Jacob, bless his heart. He ended up with 4 wives, technically. 2 of them are sisters. Did he have a good, smooth family relationship? Remember Joseph? David. He surely had a good family life, didn't he? Oh no. It ain't going to work. Why doesn't it work? I've already told you that, the answer. Creation order. How God designed things to be. Alright, okay, go a bit further. The husband should give to his wife her rights, and or some say it's the strongest duty. I think the New King James renders it affection. Do you realize in the past, not that distant past, but in the past, adultery was a crime? Do you know that? It might even still be on some principalities. It might still be on the books. And one of the names it was referred to, it wasn't simply called adultery. It was called the alienation of affection. That's what the law was called, and it was criminal. You get big trouble about it. Anyway, so we talked about both. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, to devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of control. Okay? Easy, clear language. I don't think there's any difficulty understanding any of that here. Or anywhere for that matter, if you just read what is actually said. Now, verse 6, he's shifting focus a bit. Now, as a concession, not as a command, I say this. So, notice, he's going to use himself as an example. I wish that all were as I myself am. But each has his own gift from God, one this kind, one of another. Okay? So, just let me stay in. I wish that other people were like I am. Now, what Paul is saying, he's living the single life. He's living the celibate life. And he wishes more people would be like him. But I want you to notice what he does point out. But he is not making that as a demand. Now, some groups, Roman Catholics in particular, have taken that kind of idea and made it mandatory. You know, priests are to be married to the church. They are not to be married to a spouse. Nuns have forsaken the possibility of family out of dedication to God. And Paul points out that just doesn't work for everybody. For me, Paul's saying, for me it does, and I wish more people could do that. But some people have this gift, some people have that gift, and it's okay. And it's okay. He goes on a little bit further. He's going to talk about now in verse 8. We're going to start getting into the more difficult areas to navigate. He says, to the unmarried and to the widows I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. Now here's an interesting thing about Paul talking about his singleness. What was Paul's profession, as it were, religiously speaking, prior to him coming to receive, before he became a Christian? He was a what? Well, that's his profession. What was his designation? He was a something of a something. I'm not fishing very well, am I? He was a Pharisee. At age 30, a Pharisee was to be married. So was Paul? We don't know this. We know that at this time in his ministry, he is not married, which may mean he may be a widower. He may have been married, but maybe he hadn't been. I don't know. It's kind of, he doesn't really deal with that. But he says that to the unmarried and the widows, I think it's good for them to remain single as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Okay. So if you're given the gift of, quote, celibacy, end quote, wonderful. If you're not, it's better to marry. It's better to marry. So he's laying these things out for the consideration of these Corinthians, answering their question. To the married I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. A wife should not separate from her husband. But if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. So now we're getting into the deeper areas. If you're coming up I-44, coming up toward, driving from the south, coming up, there is a sign, a large billboard, right around Rolla, up on the hill on the north side of the road, that says, remarriage is sin. Or to say divorce is sin. As soon as I tell you that, I forget exactly what it says. I think it says divorce is sin. And I think there's a Bible reference there. We need to stop for a minute. And at one time, I really did think things were much more clear cut, black and white here, than I do now. And I'll give you reasons why in just a moment. I know in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus deals real briefly with divorce there. Chapter 19, as a response to a question trying to set him up, the Pharisees ask him, is it right, is it just for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? Then Jesus points out the clarification of that. Then when you move into Mark 10, you have the same event, not all the same exact words mentioned there, but they're there. And then when you move to Luke 16, you have it again. You don't really have it in John's Gospel. But then you have it mentioned here in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. In the Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there is a very specific thing that Jesus is dealing with. I want you to hang with me here. Because what we've done over the years is we have overgeneralized what Jesus said to make it applicable to every single situation. When you look at the text carefully, you realize the question before Jesus is it right, is it just, is it acceptable for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? And Jesus says no. It said he gives the exception in Matthew's Gospel when he says except for immorality. Okay? That breaks the marital bond. But that's what he's dealing with, a very specific situation. Paul is dealing with a different situation. He's not dealing with that question posed by religious leaders, is it lawful to do this for any reasons? The Jews of Jesus' day, there's two schools of thought. One was marriage should be held in the highest esteem. The other is where the perspective of the Pharisees probably were, was a man could divorce his wife for any reason at all. He can divorce her if maybe he's tired of her. She burned his toast this morning. Her scrambled eggs are runny. He don't like it, so he puts her out. Or he sees a woman he wants more. Now that's probably embedded in what Jesus is talking about, especially in the Sermon on the Mount, because that's where it says, if you look with lust, you've already committed adultery. The point being, there's already a departure from the marriage commitment in the act of lust for someone else. Okay? So he points that out. That's what's going on here. Paul is dealing with this situation. Here he comes. He comes into a city rank with immorality of every conceivable sort. He begins preaching Christ. People begin responding to that. And then now you're going to have mixed marriages. You're going to have a wife heard the gospel. She trusted Christ, but her husband's still lost. And then, or you have a man, he hears the gospel, he responds to it, he receives Christ as his Savior and Lord, but his wife doesn't. So what do you do there? That's what he's dealing with here. What do you do? What do you do? And you're going to be surprised at what Paul says to do. Well, I'll get to that in a moment. But now I want to introduce you to something. I want to introduce you to a man that he's passed away now, but he's written. His name was Spiros Zodhiates. I want to say that so I can impress you. Spiros Zodhiates. It's really fun to say too. Spiros Zodhiates. He has written extensively. Now he was he had his his educational credentials. He was a doctor of theology, and he was a Greek. Can you guess that from that name? He was a Greek, and he was an expert in the Greek New Testament. And he has written extensively on different subjects. He wrote this book. This book, you can see here, it has 429 pages. It's an exegetical exposition from the Greek text on Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 through 32, Matthew 19, 2 through 12, Mark 10, 2 through 12, Luke 6, 18, and Romans 7, 1 through 3. 400 pages he writes on just those passages. I mean, he turns over every leaf. And some of the things that he points out here are just so helpful. It's so helpful. Because it begins casting more light on the whole issue. Also, he's written commentaries. This commentary, let me check it. It has 345 pages on 1 Corinthians chapter 7. The whole book is just on that one chapter. Now, the reason I introduce you to him is because he is incredibly helpful when it's coming to the issue of trying to work through this particular chapter and the whole issue. Oh, by the way, this is simply called What About Divorce? He's also got a companion book that says What About Divorce and Remarriage? He deals with that too. Some of the things that he points out there that are very beneficial is I'm going to give you a little more broader understanding of it, because it really helped me a great deal to help me understand more clearly what exactly is being said and why it's being said. And it's this. According to the Old Testament law in Deuteronomy, if a man found something unseemly in his wife, usually it was just the man that was the initiator of a divorce. In Jewish culture, not always the same thing in Greco-Roman culture, but in Jewish culture, women very seldom ever, though it has happened, do not initiate divorce, but a man could if he finds something unseemly in her. That's all it says in Deuteronomy. The interpretation is, what does the word unseemly mean? Does it mean immorality? That's the way Jesus understood it. Or does it mean if she burns his eggs? Something that simple. Or she mouths off to him once too many times. I don't know. He said it could be anything he considered unseemly. Well, Jesus didn't gravitate toward anything and everything. But what a man was to do, he was to give her a certificate of divorce. It was actually a document. And what he would do is he would present it to her, and he would say, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you. That means our relationship now is dissolved. I'm not obligated to you. You are not obligated to me. And when he handed her and gave her the certificate of divorce, she was free from that marriage. And she could marry again and not be considered an adulterer or adulteress. That's surprising. Didn't know that. But that was the practice. Paul's not dealing with Jews, though. He's dealing with Gentiles. Notice the situation here. And by the way, when you look at what Jesus says, his words are to protect the woman. The man is the initiator of the divorce, not the woman. And the woman, Jesus was protecting her, because that certificate of divorce would free her to be a wife of another man, a different man. Now, as we move a little bit further in here, this is what he says. To the married, I give charge, not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband. Notice, who would be the initiator in this case? The wife. Because here's the question. I have become a Christian. My wife is not. Should we remain married? Would it not be better for me to, if he's not going, or she's not going to be become a Christian, she's maybe hardened toward it, or has no desire to become a Christian? Would it be better for me to leave that marriage and hopefully find another mate that is a Christian? Because Paul's going to talk about being unequally yoked later. Well, Paul's going to talk about that. A wife should not separate from her husband. But if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. You're getting it quite clear there. The thing of it is, who's doing the initiation? But we're not done yet. Paul is not dealing with every conceivable scenario. When you hit the real world, folks, a lot of our kind of pristine theology gets smacked with reality. I'm going to give you a scenario, and from a pastoral perspective. A woman comes. Now, I have nobody in mind, and I'm not telling a story about anybody in particular that's ever happened. But if a woman comes to me, and she tells me that she's being abused by her husband, and it's obvious that she's telling the truth. Maybe he's a mean drunk. Maybe he's enjoying the wacky weed too much. But whatever, he's being abusive, physically threatening her. Even to the point, maybe at a time, where he actually pulls a weapon and threatens to kill her. Now, I want you to think for a moment. If that woman came to you, what advice would you offer her? Would you send her right back into that situation? Or would you try to find her somehow some protection? You see what I'm talking about? This is real world stuff. It's real world stuff. And sometimes when you're dealing with real world stuff, you realize my ideals have to be dealt with too. It doesn't mean that I devalue the institution of marriage at all. But there may be a crisis here. Or what if, she comes and she tells me, my husband, maybe she's remarried, my husband is sexually abusing my daughter. Do I send her back in there, or do I call the police? Are you with me? You hear me? Hear what I'm saying? So we need to kind of understand that there's the real world application of dealing with things. I'm not talking about we disregard what God says. I don't say that at all. But I'm saying there are times you're going to be forced to deal with things that are really, really messy. Paul is dealing with that. So Maybe there were some people thinking about, I have to leave married and maybe one day reconcile. It goes further though. To the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if a brother has a wife who's an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. You know, the issue of, now I know there's going to be exceptions to the rule, but a lot of times when I was in college, we called it missionary dating. You ever hear that phrase? Missionary dating? The idea is, if I date this person, young women especially are susceptible to this, unless the girl is really cute, and then guys are too. But young women are really accepted. He'll become a Christian later. I'll influence him, and he'll later become a Christian. I know that happens, but I also know it happens a lot less than people would like for it to. That's just simply called, and that's just a justification to get married someone with the expectation that one day they'll become a Christian. Paul is not lifting that expectation. He's saying if you have an unbelieving spouse and they consent to live with you, to stay in the marriage, stay in the marriage. But now he's going to later going to deal with what if they're not. Okay, we'll deal with that. In verse 13, talking about the wife now. For the unbelieving husband is made holy by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, and as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner... Now, pause for a moment. Does that mean that since you're a Christian, just because you're a Christian, that your unbelieving spouse is going to be also saved just because you're a Christian, whether they are or not? No, it doesn't. But it talks about, and this is a challenging part. If the believer lives like a believer, committed as a believer following Christ, that could very well influence the unbelieving spouse to embrace Christ eventually. Maybe. Not assured, but maybe. It's not talking about you will save that person whether they receive Christ or not. But there is an influence there. I want to tell you something that's kind of fascinating. If you get children coming to the church, there's I don't know what the percentages are, but it's like a 25% likelihood that the parents will come. If a married woman with children come to church, there's a likelihood of 35-40% chance that, or possibility that her husband will start coming with her. Both percentages are really quite low, probably lower than I even just said. But if the husband comes to church, the percentage is in the 90s that his family will follow him. That's just the cold hard facts. That's just the cold hard facts. If a man comes to faith, his family is likely to follow him. That speaks to maybe we ought to be considering focusing on men more than we sometimes do. Anyway, he goes on more. Now, I expect if you have questions, yes.
What's the word unclean mean in the latter part of 14?
That they would be unclean? I don't know. I didn't look the word up.
Sorry to ask.
That's okay. I mean, I don't want to just give you an answer unless I know it's the right answer. So I did not even look up the word what unclean means. I would suppose it would be the opposite. And I suppose it would be the opposite of holy. Because the idea of sanctified or holy and unclean are polar opposites. For when we talk about an angel, we're talking about a spirit that is holy, a holy angel. What are demons most often called in the New Testament? In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. They're not called demons. They're called unclean spirits. So I would suspect that's the contrast going on from holy, sanctified, set apart to unclean, being the polar opposite. And that is off the top of my head. But I think that there's some merit in that, at least when we talk about the angels and demons.
I'll do some studying.
Okay. Verse 15. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. Okay? Now, what we don't often recognize in the language here, when he says this, that a brother or sister is not enslaved, what that means is they are free. And that means free to marry again. That's what it means. Free to marry again. Because they have been deserted. And being deserted can take a lot of different forms. Okay? A lot of different forms. And then, of course, verse 16. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? There is that possibility there of being a godly influence. Matter of fact, Peter tells women, you know how to win your husbands? You start on Saturday night nagging them to go to church with you on Sunday morning, right? Isn't that what works? Isn't that the... No. He says that they may be won by your quiet and chaste behavior. That kind of influence, a godly influence. That's what Peter reminds us of. Okay, he goes on, verse 17. Now, verses 17 and following, raising another issue. Only let a person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. This is my rule for all of the churches. Was anyone at the time he was called already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek to be circumcised. For neither circumcision counts as anything or uncircumcision, but keeping the commandments of God. That does make all the difference. Each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Were you a slave when you were called? Do not be concerned about it, but if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself the opportunity. For he who was called in the Lord as a slave is a freedman of the Lord. Likewise, he who is free when he was called is a slave of Christ. You were bought with a price. Do not become the slaves of men. Now, he's already said that in the verse 20 of chapter 6. You have been bought with a price. Therefore, glorify God in your body. So, brothers, in whatever condition each was called, there let him remain with God. Now, Paul, why are you saying this? Why are you saying these kind of things? He's going to tell us. Verse 25. Now concerning the betrothed, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who has the Lord's mercy. I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. If you're free from a wife, do not seek a wife. Now, he doesn't tell us what it is, but he tells us there's something going on that is significant enough that you're going to have to ride this out. What is that thing? He calls it the present distress. He doesn't tell us what it is. It does imply that the present distress can cause some deep issues. For example, let's suppose that we're talking about some form, either persecution happening then or about to happen. If you have a family and persecution is beginning against Christians, you're going to be immediately concerned about the welfare of your family. If you are a goldsmith or silversmith working metals, and suddenly you're frozen out of the economy, no longer can sell your wares, nobody will buy them, you can't raise it, you have no money because no one was buying what you were making, and the so-called guilds, or what we call unions, have frozen you out because you don't worship their gods anymore. Are you going to be concerned about how you're going to put food in your kids' mouths? Anybody? It's going to be a major concern, is it not? Even if you're going to be concerned about your wife. How is this poverty of this level going to affect her? But what if it's just you? What if it's just you? You don't have the other concern. You see what I'm saying? Paul is talking about, he's talking about, remember, if we go all the way back, if you go all the way back to where he began, now concerning the matters which you worship, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. He's still talking about that. He's not affirming that marriage is not, he's not suggesting that marriage is not important. He's just saying that answering that particular statement, you have to deal with it. And if persecution starts, you're really going to have a major, kind of almost a division of, do I follow Christ even to the point of death, or do I back up a little bit so I can feed my family? What am I supposed to do? If you have the concern of a family, that's going to affect you quite differently than it will if the only person you're concerned about is yourself. And understand, there were periods of persecution in the Roman Empire that at times became pretty intense for a period of time. Nero, for example, after he burned part of Rome, apparently, allegedly, he blamed Christians as being the scapegoats. And he actually would do this. Christians were experiencing this. They were caught, they were arrested, they were covered in pitch and tar, they were put on crosses, and they were set afire. And they would light along the streets. Now, if it's just you, it's one thing. But if you've got a family dependent upon you, I think I probably beat that horse plenty there. He says, but if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I want to spare you that. This is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as if they had none, and those who mourn as though they are not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they're not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they have no goods. And he goes on, and there's a whole list. Because of whatever this present distress is, that is a significant event in the lives of these people in Corinth. And the time is short. It may not be long lasting, but it's happening. Verse 32. No, verse. Verse 32. Yeah, that's right. I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife. And his interests are divided. And to the unmarried and the betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. Um, Years ago, I was listening to a radio program, and the fellow being interviewed on this particular program was talking about missionaries. And during the conversation, I don't remember much of what was being said. I do remember one statement that this guy said, particularly about college students. He said many times college students become very enthusiastic in following the Lord. And many of those will surrender to missions. And then when they graduate, they never, ever really go on the mission field because something happens. The interviewer says, well, what happens? He says, a little red sports car. They get out of college, they get a job, they buy a car, they have obligations, and the whole ability to go on missions now is not any more available to them. Not like it was. So he said the enemy oftentimes is just the obligations of adulthood that come, and he had a very valid point. Very valid point. Paul is dealing with some of those kind of dynamics. But he's not done yet. He said in verse 36 and following, he talks about if anyone thinks he is not behaving properly toward his betrothed or virgin, is in some translations, literally that's what it is. If his passions are strong and it has to be, let him do as he wishes. Let them marry. It is no sin. A lot of times it's talking about arranged marriages in the ancient world. It could be a father dealing with his daughter. Does he give her the okay to marry or not? And Paul is saying, it's okay. It's okay. You're not sinning if you go ahead and give her in marriage or not. Or if you're and it's kind of ambiguous for us here. Or is he talking about it to a young man? You are betrothed to a woman to be married. Do you go ahead and marry her or not? And Paul says, well, if that's what you're supposed to, go ahead. That's okay. You're not sinning. You're not sinning if you do. But whoever is firmly established in his heart, being under no necessity but having his desire under control, and has determined this in his heart to keep her as his betrothed, he will do well. So then he who marries his betrothed does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do even better. And now there comes a very important statement. Probably in all of this, and if you really want to get into the details and that, you need to read a book like this, or his whole commentary on this, and because there's certain kinds of things that do not show out or show up good in English, and maybe I'll share that with you in just a moment. But I want you to see what he says here. The last two verses are essential. He says, a wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to marry whoever she wishes. 4 words. 4 words that make all the difference. But only in the Lord. So you're thinking about remarriage? Good for you. But make sure that the person you're marrying is a Christian. Make sure that's what's going to happen. I knew a gal in college, and I don't know, I haven't kept up with her for all these years since. But she was very involved in church and BSU and all those kind of things. And she married a man that was not so enthused about those kind of things. He'd go to church with her and whatnot. Last I heard, though, I don't even know if she even goes to church anymore at all. When she married this guy that actually had more influence. Because life gets routine. Have you ever noticed sometimes life's kind of hard? Anybody ever notice that? There's difficulty. There's going to be those. Yet, in my judgment, she is happy if she remains as she is. And I think I, too, have the Spirit of God. There's a little bit of, gouge there. You think you guys have got the Spirit of God? Listen. Okay. Well, I told you about these books about Spiros Zodhiates and the detail that he goes through in dealing with these subjects. Matter of fact, it's just like they're short. About he may deal with one word, and it may last about 3 pages, dealing with the tense of the verb. But there's also something called voice. It's very, very, very helpful, and it doesn't always come through in English very much. There is active voice. The boy threw the ball. Okay? Active voice. And there's passive voice. The ball was thrown by the boy. In other words, you reverse it around. And passive voice takes more words. I had a church history professor. I hated writing a paper for him because he would tell the class, and even if you go through college, you're not always taught these things. Most people have a tendency to write in the passive voice. And he told us the class over and over, he said, listen, active voice. Passive voice is so boring, and I've got to read your paper. And you get a paper back from him, PV, all over it. Passive voice. So, and those are the two main things that we see in English. But there's also the middle voice. Now, the middle voice doesn't always translate in from the Greek text, which does have the middle voice a lot. It doesn't translate into English always that clearly. The middle voice is that the subject acts and the action comes back on himself. I cooked a meal for myself. I washed my clothes. That is the middle voice. And we don't always see that. We don't recognize that so much. That becomes important in this whole discussion, because who is doing the action? And is that action the middle voice, meaning that the action comes back on the actor, or not? We can't really see that well in the English. But it's like, okay, and I know it gets confusing, and I wait to the very last moment so I can dart out of the room. Okay? But the idea, though, is when you come to the issue of divorce, who is the actor, and is the action coming back on the actor or not? And a lot of times in some of these passages, that's what's going on. It's not the innocent marriage partner that's in view. It is the active marriage partner that's in view. You follow what I'm saying? And the thing with it is, it just does not flow well in English. So, if a man marries a woman who's divorced, is he now committing adultery? It's kind of what it sounds like in English, but is that really what is being communicated? No. Actually, when you deal with the words of Jesus, Jesus is saying that the actor, the one doing it, the action, is the man, and he forces this stigma on his wife. And it may be because they're wanting to divorce her for any cause. She's innocent. She's not been unfaithful. He's just taking the action because he wants a different wife or for whatever reason. And that's what Jesus is nailing at. You're the one doing the action. You're the one causing this. And this is coming back on you. If that makes sense? Of course not. Of course not. Questions? You got a whole 4 minutes. If that clock's right. This clock says 3 minutes, so maybe you don't have 4. Let me give you a quick summary. Things are not always as clear as we think that they are. Because many times we take a very simple perspective and we nail it down. And we don't take in consideration other factors. I have a good friend. He's been pastoring for years and years and years. And right out of high school, he got married. And it wasn't long before she left him. He later married another gal. And should he have been disqualified for the pastorate because of what happened to him? Well, in some places, yes, he must be disqualified. But, coming to Christ after that, should he be held to such a standard, becoming a Christian after that kind of situation? You think about it. Are you following what I'm saying, or am I confusing you? It's tough to deal with some of these things. Because we have a lot of, what happens so much of the time is we have a lot of tradition that builds up. And we think we understand it until we begin looking at it very, very, very carefully. And then maybe we realize, well, maybe it's not quite as clear. One of my professors made this statement about, I think it was one of my professors. Somebody did. I was listening to him. I said not listening to him, so whoever it was. He said, said his professor, a professor, walked into the class. And it's like that book, I had a really bad, awful day, that little children's book, whatever it's called, Wacky Wednesday or something. Anyway, he walked into the classroom, he says, looking out the preacher, perspective, they're probably perspiring too, but perspective, pastors out there. Okay, your chairman of the deacon's daughter has run off with a man, and they don't know where she's at. You had a woman in your congregation that was involved in marital problems, and she's committed suicide. You people just make me sick. He walked out the door. He was dealing with some heavy-duty stuff, wasn't he? And sometimes we don't realize how heavy-duty things are. You're free to go.